Good morning and welcome to another MEI virtual briefing. I am Ken Pollack, the Vice President for Policy here at MEI, guest hosting today's briefing. I'm joined by two of my colleagues, Gönül Tol and Ibrahim Al-Assil. Gönül is a senior fellow and an expert on Turkish affairs. Ibrahim is also a senior fellow and expert on both Syria and the Gulf. Today, what we wanted to do was to talk about the various developments regarding the PKK. With a possible major announcement in the offing, this is obviously a source of news out there. But we also wanted to use this as an opportunity to talk more broadly about the dynamics among Syria, Turkey, the PKK, and a whole variety of other key actors, all of whom are now very much in play since the fall of the Assad regime. So I will kick things off by asking Ibrahim and Gönül a series of questions. But please, we welcome questions from the audience, which I will work in later on in the program. And just a reminder that we are on the record. So with that, Ibrahim, let me start with you. And what I'd like to do is I'd like you to start by kind of giving us a sense of the lay of the land, so to speak. We definitely want to talk about the prospects for an end to the Turkish-Kurdish war, but let's start by just talking about Turkish-Syrian relations more broadly right now. Turkey supported HTS during their campaign that successfully overthrew the Assad regime. But how would you describe its posture in Syria today? How would you describe the state of play within Syria and the relationship to Turkey? Let's get these kind of broad parameters out there before we dive in and talk about the PKK and its relationships to both Turkey and Syria specifically.
Thank you, Ken. It's great to be with you. It's great to be with you too, Gönül, and I'm looking forward to hearing also your analysis on Turkey and the Kurdish angle from Turkey. In Syria, since the Assad regime fell on December 8th, of course, that changed the relationship totally between Ankara and Damascus, because while Turkey supported opposition armed groups and political groups throughout the last 13 years, its relationship with Damascus was of animosity. But now with the new government in Damascus, we are expecting something very different. A very quick overview on the relationship and the Turkish posture towards Syria. So 2000s and a few years before 2011, Turkey had good relationship with Bashar al-Assad, and actually President Erdogan, then I think Prime Minister Erdogan, he advised Assad on being or trying to do some reforms with Syria. When Assad refused, then Turkey started to support the opposition. And fast forward to also last couple of years, also Turkey was trying to reach out with Assad. And why I'm highlighting this issue, because for Turkey, when we look at it from the Syrian angle, the Kurdish issue has been the priority in Syria. And that what pushed Erdogan and the Turkish government to actually reach out to Assad and try to work with him, because while they thought Assad will be there for a long time, the priority was to find a solution for the Kurdish challenge in the north. HTS and the battle was supported by Turkey, but it was not sponsored by Turkey. We have another armed group called the Syrian National Army, which now became part of the which is still being formed Syrian army. That's the Turkish proxy, and that's mainly the group that fought the Kurds in Syria. HTS didn't have many confrontations with the Kurds in Syria. We're going to go back to that. But I think that also these nuances are important to understand where Turkey is now in Syria and what they are trying to achieve with the economic and security and military prospects with the new government in Damascus in the future.
That's terrific, Ibrahim. That's a great scene setter. Okay, Gernal, I'm going to come to you and I want to ask you a set of different questions. Let's start by talking about the news of the day. Right? This idea that Abdullah Öcalan is going to call for an end to the PKK conflict against Turkey is obviously what has captured everyone's attention, but there's more to it than that, right?
There must be, Ken, if Erdogan and Öcalan want this to work. The PKK has been fighting against NATO's second biggest army to secure Kurdish rights for more than 40 years, and 40,000 people were killed, many of them Kurds. And the PKK won't just lay down arms if they get nothing in return. But that is what Erdogan wants us to believe. He repeatedly said, and this was an effort not to alienate his nationalist allies, he repeatedly said that the current initiative is not a democratic Kurdish opening, the way previous openings were. And he said this was just Turkish state forcing the PKK to lay down arms, nothing more. But there must be more. We just don't know what they are. The talks are being held in secrecy.
Hmm. All right. So sticking with you, Gernal, let's dig into the Turkish side of this a little bit more. What do you think Erdogan's motivations are here? Why is he doing this, and why is he doing it now?
Well, ask me that question in any context, and my answer is going to be the same. And that is his primary motivation is to stay in power. Current constitution does not allow him to rerun in 2028 elections, and he has two options. The parliament could call for early elections or a new constitution could be drafted, but Erdogan's nationalist coalition does not have the votes to do either, and he needs the support of the pro-Kurdish party in the parliament, and Erdogan thinks reaching an agreement with Öcalan will secure him that. But I should also add that the regional context and Erdogan's foreign policy agenda in Syria, Iraq, and with the US also forced a settlement.
All right. So yeah, we should dig into all of that a little bit more later on. I'm sure we'll get some more questions on it, but let's switch gears a little bit. Look at the other side. How about the PKK? What's in it for them? As you point out, they've been fighting Ankara, I think, for 46 years. Why stop now? I mean, obviously, the Assad regime's fall is part of it, but what else is going on there?
Well, the PKK's military prospects are looking grim. It's still able to carry out the occasional terrorist attack against Turkish targets, but it has mostly lost its military campaign in Turkey. Turkey has been waging a very effective war against PKK headquarters in northern Iraq with its drones. And Turkey has taken several steps to cultivate closer ties with Baghdad and the Kurdistan regional government, where the PKK headquarters are located. So add this, a weakened Iran to this mixed. Iran has had a complicated relationship with the PKK. So all these things shrink the PKK's room for maneuver. Baghdad, for example, just declared the PKK as a banned organization after pressure from Ankara. That's number one. Number two, Turkey's Kurds are also tired of 40 years of fighting. They want peace, and the PKK thinks only Erdogan can deliver that. They don't think that that Erdogan will lose elections, or even if he does, they don't think that the opposition will offer anything better. And finally, in Syria, the new government in Damascus doesn't want tens of thousands of armed men outside the control of central government, and it doesn't want an autonomous Kurdish region. Also, Iranians are weak. Iranians have worked with the Syrian Kurds, supported at times. So if Americans leave Syria too, the Syrian Kurdish militia will be in a very vulnerable spot.
Great points. And you mentioned Iraq a couple of times in there. I'm gonna before I turn back to Ibrahim, could you bring the Iraqis into it? I mean, I know from my own contacts among the Iraqi Kurds that there is an Iraqi dimension to this as well. Could you lay that out for us too?
That's definitely true, Ken. I see a reshuffling in Iraqi politics, which makes life harder for the PKK. Iran and the PKK for years exploited the division among Iraqi Kurds and also the tension between Iraqi Kurds and Baghdad. So all those problems are closer to resolution today than they have ever been. And what prompted this is several things. Again, weakening of Iran, number one, and also US withdrawal, which will happen by the end of this year. And also a very determined Ankara to cultivate closer ties with Baghdad. And these factors paved the way for landmark agreements that we've recently seen. One is, for example, a unification of Peshmerga forces, Kurdish forces, right? That's something that the Americans have been pushing for a long time, and it didn't happen. It's happening now. And the second thing is a resolution of energy problems between the Kurdistan regional government and Baghdad. Another thing that many actors have been pushing. The third is Turkey just recently agreed to releasing more water to Iraq. So this was just a big package that included so many contentious points. And Baghdad now recognizes PKK as a banned organization. So PKK disarmament will further help all these things that are already in motion.
Those are all great points, Gönül. Thank you for laying that out. All right, so let me turn back to Ibrahim. So we've been talking about this a lot as a Turkish-Kurdish issue. Gönül has brought in Iran, she's brought in Iraq, but there's an obvious Syrian dimension here as well, right? So Ibrahim, lay out the Syrian piece of this equation for us.
That's a great question, Ken. And I'll start by also giving a little bit of background on the Arab-Kurdish relationship in Syria, also to understand the complexity. So after the Syrian independence from France in 1946 onwards, in late 50s, the rise of Arab nationalism inside Syria and across the region affected the relationship between the Arabs and the Kurds inside Syria, and especially when the Ba'ath regime came to power in 1963, which Hafez al-Assad had an internal coup and later on became the president in Syria. But since 1963, the relationship between Arabs and Kurds was very tense, and there were different waves of displacement of Kurds inside Syria, and leaving them out of census so they don't get IDs. And we had even tens of thousands of Syrian Kurds who didn't even have IDs, and they were not part of the government records for decades. In 1973, Hafez al-Assad ran something called the Arab Belt, where they displaced Kurdish population close to the Syrian Turkish borders and transferred Arab population there to cut the continuation between the two populations of Kurds in southern Turkey and northern Syria. And of course, that left deep scars within the Kurdish community and deep divisions between Arabs and Kurds beyond the government policies that are real problems between the two communities inside Syria. Over the last 13 years, we can also see different trajectories when we talk about the Kurds in Syria and the Arabs. While they both revolted against the Assad rule, the grievances were very different and the goals also were very different. 2014 onwards, the United States supported the Kurdish forces in the fight against ISIS, but the Kurdish forces there also used that power to rule Arab population against their will as well. Part of it is because of the distrust, but that led to more divisions and distrust between the Kurds and the Arabs inside Syria today. Today, after al-Sharia rose to power and became the transitional president in Syria, the big question remains the negotiations between the Syrian Democratic Forces, the Kurdish dominated forces, and the authority in Damascus. There are, of course, different points about what could happen and the outcome and the demands of both sides. However, we can also see, some positive signals about that. They met with each other. A very symbolic thing, but it's huge in the Syrian context that al-Sharia started with a couple of sentences in Kurdish because Kurdish was banned in Syria. So it's important to understand that also for the Kurdish leader, when he comes and he sees a leader that acknowledging that the Kurdish language, that by itself is also a positive sign. Also from the Kurdish side, Mazloum Abdi, the leader of the democratic forces, had some positive signal that he is willing to be under the Syrian sovereignty. He started to use the new Syrian flag, which they never did, the one with the 3 stars, signaling that they are not seeking independence. They want some sort of autonomy. We're going to talk a little bit about it, but that's now where the things are, and the Syrian dimension of the Arab Kurds within the Syrian context.
So that's great, Ibrahim. That's another great layout. What I hear you saying is it's less about Syrians or even the HTS government playing a role in the negotiations, more about how the outcome of the talks between the PKK and Erdogan could then further shape events in Syria. So that being the case, I'd love to have you just talk us through, broadly speaking, 2 different scenarios or sets of scenarios, because obviously there are lots of different variations. But let's imagine how things might look if there were a ceasefire between the PKK and Turkey. What does that mean for Syria?
Mm.
What does it mean if there isn't a ceasefire for Syria?
It's very important and very consequential on what happens in Syria, even though clearly there are 2 layers when we talk about the PKK and when we talk about the Syrian dimension of the Kurdish issue, which you just mentioned in your previous question, just to show how these 2 layers, they interact, but they're also different. While I explained how much the Assad regime oppressed the Kurds nationally and ethnically, and they were not part of the Syrian social contract, at the same time, Assad hosted Öcalan for almost 20 years. So after Öcalan established the PKK in 78, the next year he moved right away to Syria, and for the next 20 years, he led the confrontation with the Turks from Syria until Turkey gave Assad an ultimatum that either Öcalan leaves or they will invade Syria, and that's when Assad at the end pushed Öcalan to seek refuge somewhere else. So Assad used that issue with Turkey, with the PKK, but not the Syrian Kurds. And until today, we see these 2 layers. So to connect it to your previous question, when we ask about what could happen in the future, the PKK are seen by many Syrians, whether Kurds or Arabs, as potential spoilers for any agreement between the Syrian Kurds and the Syrian Arabs in Syria. Let's go with the positive scenario, the first one. If there is actually a ceasefire, I think that actually hopefully would reflect if Öcalan calls on the PKK to lay their arms, and the PKK links that to their position in Syria, because also that's something I'm not sure about. But then I think that would help for the Syrian Kurds and the Arabs in Syria to reach an agreement, and that's very important for the region and for the new Syrian social contract, not to bring Kurds by force into the new Syrian social contract and the idea of Syrianism. However, if we go with the other scenario, I think that's a more complicated one, because it will have many consequences on Syrians and on the region. I think that might actually lead Turkey to intervene that's a possibility directly in Syria, because if there are more confrontations and the PKK makes sure that the Syrian Kurds don't reach an agreement with Damascus, then there are confrontations, but I doubt Damascus can now beat the Syrian democratic forces in their region. They are not as powerful, but they will be fighting in their own areas. And the Kurds are known to be fierce fighters in their areas. I think that might actually make an opening for Turkey to intervene. And then that will change the internal dynamics. Turkey will be closer in Syria. That will shock the region in a different way, especially for Arab and Israelis, the Arab countries and Israel. They will look at Syria and they would see that Turkey is advancing more and more, and that will shape their Syria policy. So that intervention, while it might just be from the Turkish-Kurdish angle, I say more and more, it will make it more likely for the region and the world to shape their Syria policy through that. That's why ceasefire is very important, because it might actually dictate how the position of Syria in the region will look like.
Yeah, that's great. And as I'm listening to you, Ibrahim, as someone who has studied civil wars more broadly and civil wars in the Middle East, the pattern that you're laying out, especially with that worst case, that bad scenario, I mean, it sounds horrific, but it's completely in keeping with how these civil wars work. Right? And so, with that in mind, you brought in the Israelis, and how do I want to put this? We can all say that Israel has been a further complicating factor in Syria since the fall of the Assad regime. Let's pick up those two scenarios again, Ibrahim. Which one makes it better or worse? I think I know the answer to this, but maybe talk a little bit about in what ways it could make Israel's role in Syria worse or better.
I think a Turkish intervention or a bigger role, even if there is, let's say, there is a peace agreements between the Syrian and the Kurds. Let's say if actually the authority in Damascus is more open for military bases, for example, for Turkey in Syria, I think that will also shape the Israeli policy towards Syria. So the Israeli reaction since December 8th was, first, there was a massive airstrike campaign inside Syria, described as one of the most powerful Israeli air campaigns in Syria ever, that destroyed military depots for the Syrian army. So with that, the capabilities of any armed forces in Syria were lowered, so they don't pose any threat to Israel. But then also Israel gradually took the buffer zone between Syria and Israel and the Golan Heights, and then they took further. And we see by satellite images that they're establishing some positions there. But all of that could be seen from the angle of how they look at Damascus, not necessarily how they look at Turkey. However, if there is a Turkish intervention and Turkey is much closer, and then it will be clearer that the future of the Turkish role will be large in Syria, I think that will make Israel more suspicious towards Syria. And also, I would add the Arab states. Saudi Arabia wouldn't, especially when we look further beyond Aleppo. That's always been seen by the Gulf as their Arab depth when we talk about Damascus and Hama and the central provinces. And they would, I think, also be very cautious in supporting the authorities in Damascus if Turkey enters Syria further militarily, and especially if it establishes any military bases there.
Yeah, that's great. Let me use this. I'll start. I'm going to ask the question. I'd like to hear Ibrahim's thoughts on it, but then I want to switch over and ask Gönül the same question, which is, how about the U.S., right? I mean, if you'd like to speculate on how the Trump administration might react, you are welcome to do so. But, also would love to hear a few thoughts from you on how the U.S. might react, how it might affect U.S. equities. And then, Gönül, I'm going to come back to you and ask you the same question before I move on to some other things. Go ahead, Ibrahim.
I think also, so far, I see that the Trump administration is looking at Syria pretty much through the Israeli lens, which is so far it's pure security lens of make sure that Israel is stronger on the borders and wait and see what the authorities in Damascus will be doing. However, I think it's very important, while the US has been doing some limited role in mediation between the Kurds and other parties in Syria, I don't think it's given the weight that it deserves. Giving that, to add to your previous questions, Ken, I think if there are new rounds of fighting, not only Turkey might intervene, it might be actually a window for Iran to go back through different also factions of the PKK to arm them through the northeast. So many people are looking at the coast and the Alawas, and they say, oh, Iran might come back from there. Actually, they might come back from the northeast as well. So I think what happens also in Turkey and then in the northeast will also dictate what type of relationship the US has with Syria in the future, because especially if it will complicate the relationship with Israel, and that means it will complicate the relationship with Syria onwards in the future, if there is animosity between Damascus and Israel, I think that will lead to have a tense relationship with the US. And I look forward to also hear Gönül's angle on that.
Great. Hey, Gönül, what do you think? What do you think of the Americans? What role or what impact?
Well, we all know that President Trump wants the Nobel Prize, right? And he was hoping to get it by resolving the Ukraine thing in 24 hours. And it's clear now that's not going to happen. So one foreign policy success story he might go for will probably be in Syria. And it's a low-hanging fruit because Erdogan can say, you know, Mr. President, you don't really have to worry about the Iranians in a post-Assad Syria. Remember, that was one of the reasons how Americans legitimized their military presence in Syria to curb Iranian influence. So that problem solved itself. And Erdogan will also likely say, you don't have to worry about the fight against ISIS either, because I'm working on it and I have full support from Damascus as well as regional countries like Iraq and Jordan. And Turkey has close to 30,000 troops and willing to put more boots on the ground. And Erdogan will say, and also I know you love Kurds, you don't have to worry about them either, because I'm working on a plan to solve my problems with the Kurds. So this is a plan, I think, that will be very appealing to Trump. So I think Trump's tendency is going to be to withdraw troops, and that will really open a new chapter in Turkish-American relations, among other things.
Mm. Let's stick with that. And Gönül, I want to come back to, you've made a few points along the way that I want to give you a chance to unpack a little bit more. What do you think the likelihood is that this actually succeeds? You've mentioned spoilers at different points in time. What are the challenges that this faces? Why don't you start with the Turkish PKK aspects? Obviously, Ibrahim, there's a Syrian side to this as well, so I'll come back to you on that. But Gönül, how about on the Turkish and PKK sides?
Well, from the Turkish side, I think the biggest obstacle is Erdogan himself. In previous initiatives where the PKK agreed to a ceasefire, the PKK held up its end of the bargain and withdrew from Turkish territory. Turkish government did not. The uprisings in Syria, for sure, complicated things, but I think Erdogan was never serious about granting Kurds the democratic demands that they've been asking for. And today, Erdogan is more autocratic and he wants to centralize more power, whereas the Kurds, one of the demands is decentralization. So I don't see how a leader like Erdogan would deliver rights and democracy, which is at the heart of Kurdish fight against the Turkish state. From the PKK side, I think there are many factions within the PKK, and any of them can spoil the process. It takes one terrorist attack inside Turkey to turn Turkish society against this new process. So the big question is, does Öcalan have the power to end this? Will PKK heed whatever Öcalan says? So that's a big question too. Öcalan and Erdogan certainly think Öcalan has the power. But remember, the PKK is not a monolithic entity. You have the Turkish branch, Syrian branch, the Iraqi one, and there is one in Europe. And Öcalan says in his own words that he's sure the Turkish, Syrian, and European branches will heed his call. But he's not sure about the Iraqi branch, which is a huge problem. And we have heard conflicting statements from PKK's leadership in northern Iraq recently, with some saying that the PKK will not lay down arms without securing a pledge from the Turkish government to address Kurdish demands. And other PKK leaders said, yeah, they will do whatever Öcalan tells them to do. But there are just so many things that can go wrong.
Okay. Ibrahim, how about from the Syrian side? Tell us about the spoilers and the challenges there.
There are huge challenges. To start with is also the demands between both sides. So what Damascus is asking the Syrian Kurds to do is the issue of to kick out the foreign fighters from Syria, to hand over ISIS prisons to Damascus, and also to allow the central institutions to go back to the northeast and to function there. What the Kurds are asking is more related to how the new Syrian army look like. They would like to join as one group, while Damascus insists no armed group will join as one group. You have to be totally within, or to join as individuals. So the Syrian army is not a combination of different divisions based on ethnicities or sects inside Syria. The other one is about governance itself and how much autonomy or decentralization they have in the Northeast. And that is challenging because these 2 points are not only negotiated between Damascus and the Kurds, they are technically also negotiated between Damascus and Turkey as well. And what Turkey is happy with, because the outcome, Turkey needs to approve it, or otherwise it won't be sustainable. And to add to the complexity, also the outcome with the negotiations with the Kurds will also inspire other components within the Syrian society to seek something similar. Talking about the Druze in the south, the Alawites on the coast, or maybe also other groups of Arab tribes in the east or in the south as well. Add to all of that, of course, also to build on what Gönül just said, the PKK being able to be a spoiler. Just a couple of weeks ago, there was a car bomb, the 10th one, in a city of Manbij, one of the cities where they have huge tension between Kurds and Arabs, in a market that killed 20 civilians. SDF said it wasn't us, but no one else claimed it. And what you hear people in the streets saying among Arabs, they say the Kurds did it. They don't say PKK or SDF or of course, and exactly as Gönül said, it takes one to spoil that. So it's very sensitive, especially that it's a two-level game with the Kurds and the Turks at the same time.
Terrific. Okay, first to our audience, I'm going to ask Gönül and Ibrahim a couple more questions, but please get your own questions ready. You can raise your hand. We'll call on you in turn and unmute you, or you're also welcome to write questions in the chat box and I'll pose them to our 2 panelists. But Gönül, I'd like to come back to this issue, that you raised right at the beginning. In terms of Erdogan and his goals, and that it's ultimately so much about him. And what I'd love to do is I'd love to pose to you the same sets of scenarios that I posed to Ibrahim, right? So let's imagine that the talks succeed, and let's imagine that they don't. What are the implications for Erdogan's policies? And I'd love to ask you about both his domestic situation and his foreign policy. So if things go well, if the talks succeed, what does that mean for him domestically and in foreign policy? And if they fail, what does that mean for him domestically and in foreign policy?
So if the PKK disarms, this will be a huge win for Erdogan at home, especially if he manages to fix the country's economy. His prospects for 2028 will be boosted significantly. If talks collapse and the PKK starts staging attacks against Turkish targets inside Turkey, that will not only jeopardize the 2028 elections, but it will also complicate Erdogan's plans to put Turkish economy back on track. On the foreign policy front, the PKK disarmament will help Erdogan in 3 places: in Syria, in Iraq, well, 4, I should say, in Syria, in Iraq, and relations with the United States and Iran. In Syria, Erdogan has long opposed the Kurdish autonomous region in Syria, and also US alliance with the Syrian Kurdish militia there. And now there's a new administration, both in Damascus and Washington, and Erdogan sees this as a perfect opportunity to solve both of his problems, right? So this will not only remove a major irritant in Turkey-US ties, but it will also bring him closer to repatriating millions of Syrian refugees living in Turkey. And that's a very significant domestic goal, which will also have implications for his prospects in 2028. But the Syrian Kurdish militia's alliance with the United States has been is one of the most important things that strain the ties. So once that's resolved, Erdogan has been trying to mend ties with Washington for a long time. And now that Trump is back in the White House, if that is resolved, I think this will really open a new page in ties. In Iraq, too, President Erdogan has big plans. He's been seeking closer defense, energy, and trade ties with Iraq. And PKK disarmament will certainly make these things much easier. And also, an agreement with PKK will remove a trump card Iran has been using against Turkey, and something that Israel has threatening to do. So that's why the stakes are huge for Erdogan, both at home and in the region. But it's also a high-risk strategy too. Ibrahim mentioned a potential Turkish military operation in northern Syria. So that's very tricky for everyone involved. For Damascus, imagine you're a new government and you have Western world sympathy, and Western world happens to really like Syrian Kurds for what they've done in the fight against ISIS. So imagine you haven't resolved your differences with them, and after Ankara's pressure, you're launching an operation against the Syrian Kurds. That's not going to look good. And if you let Turkey do that, that's a double-edged sword too, because you are at a moment when you're trying to say that, you know, I've got this, I have full control, and still allowing your neighbor to launch a major incursion. So it's very tricky. And if Turkey does that, what Erdogan is afraid of is he doesn't want to piss off President Trump. Because he still doesn't know what Trump will do, whether he will withdraw troops or not. So it's a very risky gamble.
Yeah, great stuff. Ibrahim, and again, a reminder to the audience, please do raise your hands or write questions into the chat. Would like to start working those questions in as soon as I can. But let me ask you one more. You know, you and Gönül, of course, have also talked about various regional states, and we've been talking about that in a variety of ways, but I'd love to ask you to just develop a little bit more how you think that the talks and the success or failure of the talks could affect how some of the other regional states might be interacting with Syria. Again, Gönül just put a number of different issues on the table, but obviously there's a serious side to those very same questions.
Absolutely. And I think many countries, especially because Israel is cautious already, I think Saudi Arabia will be very cautious if there is an increase in the Turkish role inside Syria. Because the Turkish army already exists in Syria, in the north west and in different parts in the mid-north. But it's limited, the role there, and it's not increasing. So the point Gönül just raised of how the new authority of Damascus is being seen domestically and regionally. While we still have American troops, we have the new Israeli troops that just entered Syria, we have the Turkish troops, we have the Russian military, the air base and the seaport that we don't know, or the naval base, I mean, their future. But still, the authority in Damascus is saying all of that is decreasing. So the trajectory is to reclaim Syrian sovereignty. But if that trajectory is reversed, if there is a new country that's increasing its intervention in Syria, I think many countries, specifically Saudi Arabia, will be very cautious to continue its support. And why I'm naming Saudi Arabia in particular, because so far it's been the major regional player in Syria, and it's positioning itself to be the gateway for Syria to the region and the world. And Syria needs that. And I think Ahmed al-Sharia strategically, he sees Saudi Arabia as the closest ally over Turkey, because I think he also knows that a Turkish role would be very problematic compared to a Saudi role in Syria. A Turkish role, the US will be cautious, Israel will be cautious, the Arab states, Jordan and the Gulf, of course, all of it will be cautious. So I think he's more open to playing a bigger role with Saudi Arabia over Turkey, while of course Turkey will play a role naturally. It's a neighbor with over almost 600 miles of borders. It's the largest neighbor Syria has.
Terrific. Okay, so let me start to bring in some questions from the audience. David Welch makes a really good point and a tough question for both of you guys, which is, Trump likes to do things spur of the moment. He likes to be a disruptor. What if he just pulls the U.S. troops out preemptively? What happens then? How does it affect the negotiations? How does it affect the outcome of the negotiations? Gönül, you want to start that one?
Sure, that will certainly put Syrian Kurds in a very difficult spot. And I think one of the reasons why the Syrian Kurds are right now less willing to grant concessions to Ankara and Damascus is because they don't know what Trump is going to do. If there is the possibility that the US troops stay in Syria, they feel like they can push for a better deal from Damascus, right? So if Trump says, we're withdrawing, that will mean the Syrian Kurds will have to agree to whatever Damascus and Ankara are asking of them. And with regards to Turkish-American relations, as I said earlier, this will really put Turkish-American relations on a better footing. And it's not just going to solve the Syria problem, but I think a removal of American troops from Syria will also help the two countries solve other files, like, for example, the S-400 question, which is a huge problem. I mean, there are American sanctions, CAATSA sanctions on Turkey at the moment because Turkey decided to withdraw the S-400s. So what does that have to do with Syria, you would ask? And my answer is that, the toppling of the Assad regime really changed the balance of power in Turkish-Russian relations in Turkey's favor. Turkey feels now it's not the junior partner in that relationship. And in fact, given the fact that Russians have relocated to Libya, where there is significant Turkish military presence, Turkey feels like tables have turned now. And it has a stronger hand vis-a-vis Russia, which means that it has more room to maneuver on the S-400 file. And that is something that President Trump will certainly want to do. So better relations between Turkey and the United States, but more vulnerable position for the Syrian Kurds.
Great. Ibrahim, what are your thoughts?
I'll echo what Gönül just said, the overall assessment that it will change the balance and it will change it at a very crucial point in these negotiations between Damascus and the Kurds if the United States just withdraw. However, I would probably add to that it doesn't mean the Kurds would just concede, because it might actually strengthen more militant factors or actors within the composition. And then also I think it will be bad again because it will make an opening for more destabilization, or maybe more Iranian support to some elements within the PKK in the northeast, which will also complicate the relationship with Israel. It might lead to a Turkish intervention. So it will really trigger a series of reactions that we don't know where it might go, while the other scenario is to play a constructive role and try to allow these negotiations to take the time that they naturally need between Damascus and the Kurds, as long as they are on the right track. I think that the US should maintain its presence there. And then later on, I think that presence should I mean, ultimately, at some point, it will either end or it will become as part with an agreement with Damascus for the US to maintain a role that serves the interest of both nations. But at the end, as the question suggested, President Trump might be Trump, and then nobody could expect what happens next.
Uh, Sticking with the theme of really hard, unpleasant questions, this one I think is really for Ibrahim. Another one of our audience members asks anonymously, in a hot conflict between the Syrian Kurds and Damascus, any indication of how the Druze and the Alawi communities would react?
It's a very important question because I will start with a further Turkish role, a bigger one, militarily speaking, in Syria, won't be welcomed by the Druze and the Alawites. So when you look at Syria, of course, there is, I mean, Turkey was the Ottoman Empire, early 20th century. It was seen as the colonial power in Syria. Now that relationship changed with big chunks of the Sunni Arabs in Syria who look favorably at Turkey. But when you look at minorities, generally speaking, besides the Turkmen, generally speaking, the minorities in Syria, they are very suspicious of a Turkish role. If we talk about the Alawites or the Druze or the Kurds or the Christians in Syria, they see that a Turkish role won't be positive inside Syria, and I think the consequences would be affected so much of what happens with the Kurds and what parts the Kurds or what role they play in the new social contract, because it will also show, is it going to be by force or by consensus again? So if it's actually by force and the Kurds are being brought into Syria again by arms, I think that would increase the distrust with other components of Syria, where they will see that Syria is on a trajectory of having a Sunni government, not a Syrian government. So I will finish by highlighting this point again, that to have the Kurds willingly be part through a compromise to be part of Syria again is very important for the idea of Syrianism, of what Syria look like and how Syrians see themselves as well. Are they going to be pushed again to highlight the Sunni and Arab identities, the sub-identities of Syria, or they will see, no, the Kurds are back willingly. That means Syria is not only an Arab country. Here are the Kurds are back. They don't want to be in a separate state. And that, of course, will affect how the Alawites and the Druze look at Syria as well.
Oh, that's terrific. Let's take a question from the Ross Harrison. You had your hand up. Go ahead, Ross.
Thank you, Ken. Thanks for a great presentation. It was mentioned that the potential for some rivalry between Saudi Arabia and Turkey in Syria, and we know that Saudi Arabia has been quite vocal about the Iranian role in both Lebanon and Syria and throughout the Arab world over the last number of years. Now, with Iran out, obviously they have some concerns with respect to Turkey's role in Syria and potentially in Iraq. You mentioned that how Shara might respond and how Turkey might respond, but what levers can Saudi Arabia pull in terms of ensuring that its interests are advanced in this rivalry that is likely to ensue in the next few months, next year? So, thank you.
If I understood, Ross, your question correctly about the Saudi leverage in
what levers could Saudi Arabia pull to advance its own interests, because it doesn't have troops in Syria and Turkey does? What can it do to ensure that its hand is stronger? It can't just rely on Jelani. So what can it do to advance its own interests?
Two major pillars here in this relationship. One is about normalization with the West, and the other one is about economy. So both these two pillars, the authority in Damascus clearly sees Saudi Arabia as their bridge to the West, that they might actually help them open more doors diplomatically, including with Saudi Arabia, with the United States. And also the other very important factor or pillar is the economic relief, the development, the funding, the investment in the future. One of the very early comments I heard from Al-Shara, he mentioned Vision 2030 of Mohammed bin Salman, as he talked about it in a very positive and favorable way. So I think the leverage, while Turkey could play a huge role in reconstruction, they have they have companies, they have expertise, but I think that more will be in the north. Central Syria and southern Syria is naturally more connected to the Arab world, and Saudi Arabia is the only country where it can take al-Sharia, normalize him again among Arab states, and then in the West, and that's their main leverage in all of this equation.
Thank you.
Gönül, go ahead. You want to add something?
Sure, I agree with everything Ibrahim just said. But going back, Saudi Arabia, what were Saudi Arabia's priorities in post-uprising Syria, right? So let's remember that. The fear of Islamism, number one, and second is this huge Turkish role, which would push for a regime change, and the third is growing Iranian influence. So I think all those problems have resolved themselves, right? I don't think Islamism, particularly these Gulf countries, they don't see Islamism as a huge threat. It died everywhere. It died in Turkey in itself, right? In Tunisia. So I think there is less of a threat perception from these countries vis-a-vis political Islam. And also Ahmet al-Shara's statements and the fact that he depends on the Saudis to be able to govern Syria is a huge relief for the Saudis. And obviously no Iranian significant Iranian presence in Syria. So that's why I think when Riyadh looks at Syria of today, they're not too concerned. One concern could be what Turkey could do. They really don't want Turkey to shine. And Erdogan understands that, because Erdogan relies on Saudis as much as al-Shara for financial reasons. And that's one of the reasons why Erdogan was okay with Ahmet al-Shara paying his first foreign visit to Saudi Arabia. And he's just taken a back seat. And all government officials in Damascus are going out of their way to tell Western media that, you know, we're not under the thumb of President Erdogan. We want to cultivate ties with everyone. That's a message basically suggesting that, you know, this is not 2011.
So I want to come back to you with another question from the audience. You talked a little bit already, talked a fair amount about the relationship between Erdogan and Trump and how this might play out. And obviously, there's some synergy in that Erdogan would kind of like the U.S. to get troops out of Syria, and Trump would really like the U.S. troops out of Syria. And obviously, if Trump gets a Nobel Prize, you know, so much the better while he's doing it. But what else? You know, you mentioned the S-400 and the F-35 issue. What other things might the Turks be able to use? What other things might Erdogan be able to use to entice Trump into doing this, especially if, let's recognize some of Trump's advisors might actually be saying to him, let's not pull the troops out so hastily?
I think what Ankara is currently saying is good enough for Trump. So Erdogan is saying that the US has nothing to worry about. It has zero reasons to stay in Syria. And just a few months ago, Erdogan directed his Ministry of Defense to work on plans, military plans, to make sure that the fight against ISIS doesn't get interrupted. So they are now, the ministry is drafting plans, and they will, I think, soon present that to President Trump. Basically, as I said, this just will take care of ISIS, and Iran is not a big issue, and we're working with the PKK. So those are all great points, and what I think President Trump expects Erdogan to do. And this will really provide an invaluable opportunity to President Trump to say that he solved a problem that President Obama and Biden created, which was US engagement in a Middle Eastern country, right? So I think as long as Erdogan assures Trump that the ISIS problem is going to be resolved, I think that should be enough. But he also has to make sure that to convey to President Trump that he's not going to intervene fight against the Syrian Kurds.
Terrific. Okay. So we've had a number of questions from the audience all around the same issue, and I wanted to kind of group them together and put them to both of you guys as our final question, which is ISIS, Daesh, right? You guys have talked about it in a whole variety of different ways, but let's put it front and center. What does all of this mean for ISIS? What does it mean for the fight against them? What does it mean for their ability to play? You know, they love to be, you know, in the interstices of these other different groups, and, you know, where they can hide in the shadows and work the different groups against each other. So, Ibrahim, let me start with you, and then Gönül, you'll get the last word. But let's put ISIS, you know, under the spotlight. What is this, these potential agreements? What are all the shifting relationships? What does it mean for ISIS?
I think for ISIS, a Kurdish Arab agreement is a threat for them, because the other scenario might actually give them a potential, any destabilizing factor would give them an opening again. So if there are clashes between Damascus today, the authority, Ahmed al-Shara, and the Kurds, ISIS might use that to try to find an opening to go back and maybe recruit other fighters. Otherwise, I see it on the decline, besides the challenge of the prisons, because that by itself is a huge challenge of what will happen, who will manage them, what about the women and kids there, where they would go, etc. All of that. But besides that, outside the camps and the prison, I think they are on the decline. And I do think that al-Shara, compared to Assad, among many other factors, that al-Shara understands them more. So he is more effective in being able to dismantle their networks. I mean, he was part of it at some point. So to dismantle their networks. And I think that cooperation might be also a way to further, which is happening now, but also to happen more and more, for trust building measures with the West and with other regional countries in fighting terrorism, which is, I think, a mutual interest of Turkey, Israel, Saudi Arabia, Jordan, Iraq, and which is another very complicated relationship now between Syria and Iraq, and everyone else. And I think al-Shara is very interested in being able to fight that, because it's also a real test of how serious he is, that being more, trying to seem more and more moderate, and also his capability of controlling security in Syria. So I think it's going to give it a priority. And if there is no huge change and shifts happening, like an infighting with the Kurds, I think the trajectory is positive in that way.
Terrific. Gönül, what are your thoughts on the ISIS?
Well, shortly after, I mean, I talked to some Turkish defense officials right after American elections, because at the time they were talking about the potential US troop withdrawal. So I asked them this exact question: what would happen to ISIS? And they said, you know, that they were really worried, because this involves, fight against ISIS involves, from Turkey's point of view, multiple theaters that they have to control. Turkey is one, Syria is another one, and Iraqi theater is another one. So Turkey has been pursuing this multi-track process, and there are just so many moving parts. So on the diplomatic front, that's a challenge. And the second thing is the military challenge. And I was frankly surprised to hear that, because we often talk about how capable Turkish military is. It's the NATO's second biggest army. And yet these defense officials were saying that, yes, we do have boots on the ground. We do have military capabilities, but it's still not enough. It has to be a collective effort, and we are happy to lead that collective effort. And the third concern that they raised was So if we lead this anti-ISIS coalition, we are going to be the main targets. Turkey is going to be the main target because ISIS has established this networks, wide networks in Turkey, and they will fight back. And that is a huge problem for an Erdogan who is getting ready for 2028.
Perfect, Gönül. Right on time as always. Let me bring this to a close, and please join me in thanking our two outstanding speakers. I hope this was informative and useful for all of you, and we look forward to seeing you again at another virtual briefing in the future. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Ken. Thanks, Gönül.
Thank you.